Welcome everybody to this penultimate event of the Scientists Warning Europe Pre-COP, Planet in Crisis. We hope you've seen a lot of interesting events so far. We're delighted to have you at this event, Mother Earth, Purification and Climate Change, an Indigenous call for human consciousness and commitment. We also hope after this you will be joining us again for the following talk, which will follow hard on the heels of this by Professor Bill Newmow. And this talk will be ending at 1:45, at the latest at 1:50, in order that we can get ready for the next talk. Please welcome José Barreiro, please. And José is a writer, journalist, oral historian, field organizer of major public events, a curator, an activist, a scholar, an editor-in-chief, appears for 40 years and has been working for 40 years on social and human rights activism on behalf of native peoples, right from the early 1970s to the present, and he's recognized for his consistency as communicator and advocate. He's visible as an advocate of ingenuity in a lifelong mission to create understanding and application of an indigenous philosophy of localized community, valuing the human-land-nature relationship and the great range of ecosystemic knowledge of native cultures. José, thank you so much for joining us, and I'll now hand over to you.
Thank you very much, and thank you to David Waters for your invitation initially. In ancient Taino, Hahom. So good morning to everyone here. It's morning in any case, afternoon to some. I'd like to start by acknowledging that this day, today, this moment has its own personality in the Western Hemisphere. In the Gregorian calendar, today is 8 November, but in the most ancient chronology in the Americas, the sacred calendar of our Maya brothers and sisters, today is 10 Kawok. I use the term sacred for this ancient calendar because it resides in the spiritual and speaks from the innermost emotions of the human being to the major directions and cosmic forces in all of nature. Today is Kawok. Kawok is woman. It is grandmother, it's midwife. 10 Kawok. It speaks to the 10 fingers, 2 hands, the sacred hands of the midwife. So it is the day of woman, today, Mother Earth, which signals the source and the creation of all life. This morning, I am certain throughout Guatemalan highlands and Mexico, Honduras, many places, thousands of Maya traditional Ajben, the praying people today, they burn or will burn Copal Pom in ceremony to the spirit of this particular day, which is to say, the meaning, the message of this day. Thus begins the day for those who stay in the consciousness of the Mother Earth. For many other native spiritual practitioners, perhaps their day might begin with the burning of the sacred tobacco. Tobacco is a central sacrament for the large majority of native peoples, the sacred tobacco. Not Winston-Salem, not Marlboro Man. Tobacco is a sacrament that threads the needle of all activity, all agriculture. This tobacco, this plant, rolled in a pipe or dropped into a fire. In much of the native world, it is the smoke that opens up the connection to the spirit of Mother Earth, to all of the spirits of the natural world. My own cacique Panchito from the Guantanamo Mountains of eastern Cuba, he smokes his rolled tobacco to the 4 directions, to the 7 sacred elements of nature, Mother Earth, the waters, the winds, the grandmother moon, the sun father, and the ancestor faces reflected in the stars. And his message, the message of nearly all, if not all, indigenous ceremony, appreciation, giving thanks as human beings for their offerings, the gifts of the natural world, the gifts of creation. I start with this attention to sacred tobacco because it signals and determines spiritual communication, dialogue with the natural world. This communication, as we know, is not yet recognized by westernized science, nor by the major religious traditions stemming from the biblical patriarch Abraham in the Middle East. Still, among indigenous peoples of the Western Hemisphere, it is very often where their conversation about the fate of the earth begins. That exploration begins with the appreciative human heart, within a concept of reciprocity, with the intent to observe and to listen and to respect. There is a prophetic tradition. There is an extensive and profound empirical tradition. There is a philosophical tradition, elaborate, millennial, and practical. There is an emerging literature about native science in many fields of life and study. Some will know about the Hopi prophecies carried to international forums by Elder Thomas Banyaka and others. There are other prophecies as well among many nations. The Seneca Nation scholar, John Mohawk, liked to remind us that even in as early as the late 1940s, just after World War II, a delegation of Hopi elders in an old station wagon visited the Haudenosaunee or Iroquois longhouses in the eastern part of the United States, met with them and with other traditional peoples to share prophecies precisely about humanity's impact on the ability of our planet, of the earth, the Mother Earth, to sustain life. In the Hopi meeting with the Haudenosaunee traditionalists, prophecies and observations were exchanged that signaled the destruction of civilized society as a result of its assault on nature. The prophetic message warned that the earth's capacity to nurture and to continue to create and sustain life was diminishing, and that a time of purification was upon us, when she would begin to purify, or say, to rectify from the assault suffered. Since then and before, indigenous leaders have been sounding the alarm over the growing convergence of scientific prediction and native prophetic and empirical tradition. 45 years ago, Onondaga clan mother Alice Papineau and Hopi spokesman David Monongwe, assisted by a young Tom Cook Mohawk, led a delegation of native elders and activists to the Human Environment Forum in Stockholm, Sweden, to deliver a warning on the fate of Mother Earth. 3 years later, at the founding of the United Nations Conference on Indigenous Peoples in 1977, it fell to Onondaga Faithkeeper, Oren Lyons, to issue the statement of purpose as agreed to by dozens of American indigenous elders. Chief Lyons, I'll never forget, he said to the assembly, "I see no seat for the eagles, no seat for the whales, no seat for the buffalo." At that seminal conference, which introduced the indigenous thinking to the international arena, all of the elders pledged their peoples to the task of speaking for and helping to guard the Mother Earth. From the Hopi, from the Mayan, Lakota, Taino, so many others, native elders have since then emerged to address this grave issue. I'll add that at that Geneva conference, it was a human rights conference. There were horrendous massacres, human rights abuses being suffered by the indigenous peoples. And all of the delegations, before the human suffering, demanded that the main spokespeople speak about the assault and the rights of the Mother Earth. So it was a deeply ingrained and deeply felt message. That was 40 years ago, over 40 years ago. That was a lot of scientific studies and many international conferences ago. We know there is no lack of scientific evidence about what is happening and even what needs to be done, but the political will is weak. The economic motivations and oppositions are fears to any solution to climate change, global warming issues. Barbaric even, fierce opposition. And the discussion of climate change and the impact on Mother Earth, most understandably, is fear-based. The climate change crisis represents an important fundamental challenge of Western science and policy to incorporate into its methodology a large dose of the wisdom and knowledge held by traditional native peoples about the interrelatedness of life on Earth. Not a few native philosophers have pointed out the consequence of short-sighted, compartmentalized thinking characteristic of the modern industrial state society. Dakota author Vine Deloria Jr. reminded us that in native societies, the world is a unified fabric of life in which everything has the possibility of intimate knowing relationships, because ultimately everything is related. Pueblo professor Gregory Cahet emphasized that native science is about mutual reciprocity, a give-and-take relationship with the natural world, which presupposes a responsibility to care for, sustain, and respect the rights of other living things, including plants and animals, and the place in which one lives. It is time for such pre-modern ideas, long dismissed by the industrial world, to regain their place on the intellectual and policy agendas, to regain their place in the hearts and minds of all human beings. Remember that this is not only a philosophical issue for Native people. Native rights and issues are primarily place-based rights. Indigenous economies and societies are nearly always locally, always land-focused. For this reason, tribal lands are sometimes referred to as the miner's canary of climate change. Indigenous people feel the effects sooner and more acutely than wealthier industry-based portions of society. It is important both that Indigenous knowledge be reconsidered and that action is taken to mitigate the impacts, specific impacts on Indigenous communities. Most of you will know this, I hope, but I need to reiterate, in the Arctic, the effects of climate change are enormous and developing even more rapidly than scientists had predicted. Along with shrinking sea ice and melting permafrost seriously endangering the lands and livelihoods of circumpolar peoples, are major changes in bird and animal migration patterns, plant communities, and even insect cycles. The transformation of the Arctic is dramatic, and the world's attention is drawn to it, but the Arctic is literally only the tip of the iceberg. Changes in climate, weather patterns, and plant and animal behavior are increasingly reported by Indigenous people everywhere. Yet even today, such changes are often dismissed as weather anomalies, isolated incidents, or environmental issues, and not as part of a bigger shift in the global climate to a much larger transformation that is taking place. It is time to regain that integrated understanding of the world that for millennia, until colonization, has characterized Native traditions. Throughout the Indigenous world's models of climate change, and indeed, overwhelming current oral testimony point toward increased drought, more frequent and more severe storms, the drop of water levels in lakes and rivers, the rapid melting of the Andean glaciers, rises in sea levels, and all of that we know. The northward migrations of warmer temperatures bringing in changes to vegetations. Elders of many nations subscribe to the concept that human decisions and actions today must consider effects upon 7 generations. Preserving the health of the Mother Earth is the gravest responsibility of our generation. I guess there's no more important matter now before humankind than the question of how to live successfully and sustainably on Mother Earth. So we honor the request of our elders from the southern Mapuche to the northern Inuit, from the Maidu to the Mohawk, to urge humankind forward in the exploration of a better way of living on Mother Earth, a more spiritual way of living on Mother Earth. So I'm happy to add my voice to the call to consciousness and climate change. Increasingly, scientists are also requesting to hear from Native people their opinions, stories, observations on the causes and effects of climate change. Perhaps as a whole, we can develop this most important unity of thought, consciousness. It is an issue of science, and no doubt of that, but importantly, more importantly, it is an issue of culture and worldview, and it is a spiritual relationship that we have while we live on this earth. Generally, still in most places, Native life sustains practices within ecosystems, ecosystemic. Native community life sustains thinking and action that must observe nature systems and cycles, that pays attention to weather and climate, animal and plant migrations, temperature and moisture. This is a strong tradition and a set inclination based on deep perception and sustaining even as conditions change, as signal even in prophecy. Mother Earth is hurting. It's a message heard among many elder traditions. Everywhere, among elders, there is great concern. This is really, I want to emphasize, distinct from New Age type reinventions. This is from the indigenous discourse itself, how people talk with each other, among Native elders from different nations, and with other peoples around the world. As the human being does not restrain himself, the earth will purify herself. This is the prophecy of the purification. And we know that this is happening. We will fight against the destruction, but ultimately we may need to heed our elders' advice. They warn that the white man is not likely to change. They advise their own people, prepare to meet the conditions. When I say white man, I don't mean a race. I mean a way of thinking that commodifies everything on earth, as opposed to a way of thinking that starts with respecting everything on earth before it makes a move. As Chief Lyons, faith keeper Oren Lyons, often reminds us, there is no anger, but there's also no pity in natural law. So prepare to meet the conditions. The messages come through nature, through the observations of daily and seasonal activity, through ceremonial connection, and through dreams. I have testimony from over 3 decades with culture-bearing elders from Caribbean, Mesoamerica, much Maya, Haudenosaunee, Iroquois, Mohawk, Northern Great Plains, Lakotas, other cultures, indigenous people who live in primary relationship with nature, what is sometimes denigrated as primitive. Primary relationship with nature. Very often comment on the alarming changes they see. For my own elder culture, I offer the oral traditions and the spirituality of the cacique of the mountain, Don Panchito Ramirez, from the community of La Rancheria in the mountains of Guantanamo, eastern Cuba, who I interviewed over many years. And he has reported for over 2 decades his dreams with the Mother Earth. Panchito is a very sincere man, and he reports that she tells him that she is troubled by her children. She speaks calmly, he says, with the patience of a mother, but she fears the heat of the sun. He almost burns me now, she tells Panchito in his dream, in her dream. In the summer sun dances held in the Lakota country, elders speak directly about their concerns over the new effects, the droughts, the disrespect for the natural systems. Our family relation and elder there, Beatrice Holy Dance long visitor, head woman and grandmother of a respected ceremonial sun dance. That's the message she reported in her years of leadership on this earth. Protect the earth, she told us. Keep the land healthy. Protect the women. We hear similar messaging from throughout the hemisphere, from the Arctic Circle to the people of the South. In the North, they say seasons seem to slip. The warming trend is noticeable everywhere. Most recently in the Andes, the ancient mountain glaciers, natural dams that supply most of the needed water in that vast region. The glaciers are melting at alarming rates. Disappearing natural ice everywhere, from the Andes to the Arctic. As the white of the mountain ice recedes and the dark stone emerges from underneath, the mountains turn dark. Looking at their sacred mountain, the Apu, Ausangate, I have heard the Quechua Andean elders say, the Apu, the mountain, is now dressed in dark. She must be in mourning, or he must be in mourning. Among the many institutions of Native communities, tribal colleges, tribal governments, special groups and coalitions, many are addressing, researching, and mitigating against the impacts. There's great concern about clean water and everything else we've spoken about, because the people of the salmon, they want to save the salmon. The people of the sturgeon want to save the sturgeon. The people of the buffalo, in fact, have been bringing the buffalo back to the Great Plains. Huge effort over the last 40 years. That's a great story. The corn farmers, people who pick the herbal medicines, the basket makers who depend on particular species of trees, they all notice changes, alarming changes. New beetle infestations wiping out important trees like the black ash, crucial for basket making in many places. Thousands of such examples empirically gathered, increasingly logged and respected. Big changes, big impacts. The Native peoples notice, speak about it, respond in prayer, in ceremonies of healing for the earth and the universe. The world, El Mundo, as it's called. Ceremonies of appreciation, ceremonies that seek balance are held. In the midst of many social problems and historical traumas, the Native peoples respond to this issue most directly, from the heart, with the connectivity of spirit in many forms and in many fronts. The deepest hope among Indigenous people that I have heard, Indigenous elders, is that white man I talk about, that he will wake up, that he will act not as a corporate CEO, but that he will act first as a grandfather and really reflect that whole class of people that hold the levers of power, really reflect their humanity as they would express it, as they would propose it for their own future generations. There's a shift in consciousness that's needed across the world. And there are indigenous concepts and philosophies and ways of thinking that need increasing discussion, need to be at the forefront of the challenge to the thinking that has developed over 5 centuries, over centuries, of discarding the communication from the natural world. There's so much to be expressed on this subject, and my voice is just a little voice. There are some very profound people that are on the same quest, and the young people of the traditions are coming back. Not too long ago, the elders were bemoaning that the young people were not paying attention to their teachings. Very little of that anymore. The young people are paying attention. They're trying to figure it out. And they're fresh. Our own young people are just as fresh as everybody's young people. It needs to be worked on that way as well. It needs to be reawakened that way. Ahom. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you very much, Jose. So a lot to think about, and I very much endorse your question. When is the white man going to wake up? As I think probably very many people who are listening to this are probably thinking. Hearing your last comment about the younger people, I think it's worth immediately going to a question on this from Brian McGavin. Do you think younger Indigenous peoples, more connected to Western society, are still connected to environmental challenges and working to add their voice?
Yes, the answer is a resounding yes at this point in history. The young people are at the forefront of many struggles, many challenges right now. And the middle generation, between our elders, our grandparents, and the new generations, are forceful about the need for culture, for identity, for a healthy environment, to have healthy minds, healthy bodies, and conscious that that relationship needs to be there for our own young people not to get lost. And this happens to every teenager on earth. Our children are grabbing for those phones just like everybody. But at the same time, there's serious commitment coming up in that generation, and of both kinds, of defense of the Mother Earth and of rebuilding and building our own communities, which are in dire need of serious retooling as well after a lot of insult to them. So yes, it's happening. The young people are coming back to the tribes that go off to college. It used to be they would disappear in the society. Now almost everyone comes back, unless they're in such a career that they can't find what they need to do at home. But the impetus is to come back, to come home. So that all augurs well for our communities in the midst of not very good news.
Thank you. Now I'm just going to shorten a couple of questions from the same person, from Kevin Webb, and put them together. Then maybe you can answer them as you would like. Can you comment on Buddha's enlightenment? The first thing he did was to touch the earth. But then Kevin also asks, do you believe Mother Earth sent COVID to us as a wake-up call? Oh, sorry. All right. You need to unmute, Jose. Unfortunately, that was my mistake. Am
I on now? Okay. No, I think all spiritual practice starts with that some sense of enlightenment, some self-reflection, some sense of presence of mind is the beginning. This is what fasting is about. It's what isolation in the woods is about. It's all of those practices that lead us to ourselves. There's some serious thought that this is a response from the earth. The earth, when the elders speak of traditional law, natural law, the first recognized law of the Mother Earth is to make life. That's what it knows how to do. That's what it's going to do, no matter what kind of life it is. It may not be us, but it's gonna make life. That's her duty, and she's doing it in connection to all the other elements of the world. So that was the sense of that purification prophecy, is that she will find ways to correct herself, to correct the issue for herself, to make sure that the natural law prevails. So it's not unusual to hear that thinking, that yes, this is that. It even has lessons for our people, for all people, because in spite of all the confusion and the fear of it, it has brought the families closer together. People don't go out to do other things, and so the being close to home, that's a culture in itself. The being satisfied with the issues of your home and your house and your land and how you're going to prepare your surroundings. That's a whole philosophy that this modern world plucks us out of constantly and fragments our thinking daily. So it diminishes one's strength. So I think that all those things need to be encouraged in society.
Thank you. Margaret Beasley asks, shouldn't we learn from this that we belong to Mother Earth and we do not own the Earth? And then a connected comment I made myself was, following on from that in the previous question, do you feel that Indigenous people's attitude and respect for Mother Earth can be compared to the calls that come from many religious leaders around the world currently to look after it, protect it, and nurture it?
Well, yes, the cause of I think human beings just, if you have a belly button, you belong. You're part of something, and so to reach that perception that of all spiritual people, it's amazing that some can go by that so superficially and not connect to all these bounties of nature, all this wonderful gifting of nature. And that's, if you look at native religion, or native spirituality everywhere, that's appreciation is the first principle. Appreciation is the first principle. You start from there. That's mental health. That's natural world health. It's the many cultures, they call this the original instructions to the human beings. The original instructions was, because you have the power you have to think things through, to create, to change, to make so many things. Once in a while, you have the instruction that you have to stop and give thanks. In your tradition, give thanks. That communication, well, some people, it's just a nice thing to do. It's always a good idea. And then people who do it a lot and knock on that door, they find that the earth remembers them too. You can't just knock once or twice in an elder's door and think that they're going to attend to you. But once they know that you're serious, once that connectivity is there enough and the sincerity, my grandpa used to say, nature responds to human sincerity, but you got to find your sincerity, and that's not always easy to find. So it's on that plane. I think the question had an earlier beginning that I didn't answer, but I forgot what it was.
Okay. We've had another question. How can we ensure that the words, practices, concerns, and solutions of Indigenous communities are heard and can be built upon by science and other people?
Well, it's who does the listening and who gathers the voices. Because among all peoples, including Indigenous peoples, there are those who really know a lot and can express it, and at the same time know the world at large and can incorporate that. And those voices exist, and they're not all that numerous, but they exist and are working hard, from community bases to universities. The Indigenous thinking emerging from the communities themselves is growing. And so one has to know who to look for that to transfer, to begin to be a true dialogue and not just preaching. And so that needs to happen. And on the other side, the scientists who have the heart as well as mind and understand and know that they're missing something or that there's more to be known. And some are saying it, that the answers are not going to come through science. That's just the technical answers. The real answer has to come with the political will and the spiritual drive that drives political will. And so who's listening is very important, and who does that. But I think the native peoples have always responded, as I was mentioning in my talk. It's from in these past generations, from the 40s, they've been seeking each other out to talk about this, and from the 70s and 80s, it's good explosion. So the allies that are necessary. But remember, young people, native people are in many struggles right now, serious struggles, assassinations every day. Evangelical sects, and I'm going to say it that way, I'm not afraid to say it, evangelical sects that call formal, very respectable religious native spirituality practices witchcraft. And there are people being killed behind those accusations of witchcraft, like the Mayan calendar that we started this talk with. It's a major tradition followed by millions of people, thousands of years old, deep in wisdom, deep in knowledge about everything. And not long ago, we had a medicine man of that tradition burned to death behind accusations of witchcraft. So, you know, we have people in the world that really want to listen to this, and we have people in the world, the same as the early Inquisition, who just want to kill, want to destroy, want to erase pictographs, devil's work, all this craziness. You know, I'm not even talking about the established Christian churches. Even the Catholic Church has made its peace more or less with a lot of this. You know, there's a lot more dialogue with those established, more long-term, but there's a whole new thing going on. And so that's very dangerous. I'm sorry to go on a tangent for that, but it's really, I think, one of the gravest threats to this way of thinking. It's like it wants to stamp out anything that has a nature connection. So anything that tries to connect spiritually, my goodness, to the sun, the earth, the cosmic family, that's where the basis of the altars are, and how to address that, how to bring down blessings and energies, cosmic energies, which is what we are according to science anyway. So there's a lot of great potentials there for that dialogue, and the sooner we get it moving and organize it properly, the better, because we need it all. We need it all.
From the perspective of Indigenous peoples, who is it that you would identify as those that we need to get moving on the issue of climate crisis and the environment faster? Is it the individual? Do we need to wake up the millions, if not billions, of individuals in the world? Is it the political leaders? Is it the business leaders? Or is there some other group that you see as the key group to get going?
Yeah, there's the long term and the short term, I guess. In the long term is the youth, the young people. We have to reach them. We have to put the materials together. We have to insert these kinds of possibilities of thought into all curricula, everything from grade school. We need to deepen those dialogues with the religious leaders of the world. I mean, I'm on a particular campaign right now about this witchcraft accusation, and I'm wondering at what point are these churches going to be challenged to have a more humane thinking about this. So those are religious leaders. They reach a lot of people. So we need the good religious leaders to challenge that consistently. In the business world as well, there are some business concerns that have it figured out. They know that all this is happening, and they have to adapt, and they have to figure out a different world. But we also have a corporate world, a mega corporate world that has a crust of leadership ExxonMobil and all these companies that held back the information and held back the possibility of working on these issues early on, but with criminally, just completely criminally. And in our own country here in the United States, it's very obvious what's gone on. So we wonder about these corporations that are on that side of the issue that are just saying, well, we really should control. There shouldn't even be a government, because what the heck, we give you your milk, don't we? We provide you your clothing, your bread, your car, so why do we even need a government? So there's some real deep thinking from the rapacious side going on. And not because you're in business, even because you've made money doesn't make you a horrible human being. That's the system that people have come up in. So how do we make allies? I think the question of allies, how to make allies based on what serious discussions, what serious methodologies, and we have to hurry. Just so the long term and the short term, all tactics are serious, but we always have to think where people's sustenance is going to come from.
I totally endorse the idea that we have to get allies and fast. And in a small way, we've had an ally on our series of programs, actually. Pucker Herbs, a tea company now owned by Unilever, has sponsored us, but they've also declared a climate emergency. They're a B Corp. Their founder is very, very aware of what they've been doing in local communities to make sure that they improve the local communities. They're very careful of the land where they are planting the seeds for their crops. So very, very, very aware, and actually owned by Unilever, who have a lot of different issues. But the ex-managing director of Unilever, Paul Polman, has now turned out to be a climate campaigner of the likes of Al Gore. So there are these people around. I may just come in with one last question, I think now. It's from Bill Dowling. Do you think the best way to convert modern Western societies to your indigenous people's way of thinking is to reintroduce them to the natural world? Above all, to get them out of their cities and mega cities to see it before it's too late to experience it. Pictures and films of how it is, and worse still, and how it is still won't work, will they? And I just add a poignant observation to that. If we were thinking about the youth stuck in New York or London in a place which they probably have to go quite a long way to even see a tree, how do we reach them so that they're going to be supporting the indigenous perspective, and in fact the perspective of many of us working on the climate crisis?
Yeah, it's more difficult the further away that one is from just nature itself and working within nature and seeing how it impacts your life. So it is difficult, and this whole way of thinking has left us with huge problems to rethink. This accumulation of people in particular areas in the city, civilization, it's all about building cities that suck in from the countryside, what they need. So, I mean, the system itself, not to blame anybody who lives in the city, but the system itself was molded as a tentacles into the city, into creating that artificial environment. What to do with 12 million people, 15 million people in one place? Some of it is urban gardening and all of that. I mean, there are possibilities, because all you need is 4 square meters of ground somewhere, or 2 square meters of ground, and you can have a garden. I mean, so yes, get the kids, get their hands in the earth. Completely. I completely agree. And not just in sports, but in actual activities. I mean, gardening, you leave it to me, every kid would be doing a garden first thing in the morning in school, some kind of food producing activity, because, the native people are not foolish. All of spirituality revolves around the nurturing power of the earth and what she gives us. And 90% of that gratitude is for the varieties of foods that the earth has produced, which we've begun to kind of mess around with a few, and then science, the food scientists have messed around with it plenty, but still, we know very infinitesimal amount of what nature really has in store for us that way. So everything like that can really help. But it's big problems, just like these nuclear plants. If you don't attend to them, they become nuclear bombs. So this is what we're inheriting from the world, and boy, we got a lot of it needs thinking and redoing, but it is a big issue for people in the cities how to create a more direct connection. It's but there's ways.
Great, thank you very much. I just to add in one comment actually from a Professor Goulson, who did a talk on the insect apocalypse in the last couple of days, and he showed a picture which looked like a rather perfect, very neat family back garden, and said that it made him cry because actually there wasn't a plant in it. All the grass was artificial and all of the coverings were plastic, and there was absolutely nothing natural in it whatsoever. And he said this virtually makes him cry when he sees pictures like this. So,
well, one last comment: the person who does that, that's what he or she were taught.
Sure. So, Jose, thank you so much. Thought-provoking, actually urging us to action on behalf of ourselves and Indigenous peoples and everybody who believes that we should be connecting more to the earth and nature and protecting it. So thank you so much for your talk on that.